Good evening. I'm happy to welcome you all to the last of this year's Franke Lectures in the Humanities here at the Whitney Humanities Center. Each year, the annual Franke Lectures in the Humanities are organized in conjunction with an upper-level undergraduate humanities seminar. The lectures are made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke and are intended to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience. The fall 2021 Franke Lectures in the Humanities have been organized in conjunction with the Yale College seminar, Mass Incarceration in the Soviet Union and the United States, taught by Professors Timothy Snyder and Jason Stanley. Tonight, we are pleased and honored to welcome Lori Gruen. Professor Gruen is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University. She is the author or editor of 15 books and dozens of important chapters and articles. She works at the intersection of practical ethics and political philosophy. Gruen is a founding faculty member and the creator of the Faculty Advisory Committee of the Center for Prisoner Education at Wesleyan University. She has taught incarcerated students at Bayview Correctional Facility, a women's prison in Chelsea, New York, now closed, the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, when it was a women's prison, and Cheshire Correctional Institution in Cheshire, Connecticut, a maximum security men's prison, and York Correctional Institution, a women's prison. And today, she will present her paper on carceral logic. Professor Gruen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Stanley. I'm honored to be here. One of the things that I'm going to do tonight is to talk through two really conceptual ideas, carceral logics on the one hand, and an abolitionist critique on the other. And I realize that for many of you, it's the end of the semester. I understand that there's a lot going on, so I really appreciate your being here. I also made some slides that I'm going to share now, and so at least you'll be able to follow along since we don't have handouts and the like. So as Professor Stanley said, my talk is entitled Carceral Logics, an Abolitionist Critique. You may remember that afternoon last April 20th, like many people across the US, you may have been tensely waiting to learn what the Minneapolis jury would decide in the murder trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd. Due to the pandemic, we all were able to watch the trial, and that would only have been witnessed by family and locals if we weren't in a pandemic. But as the judge read out the verdicts on the three charges against Chauvin, second-degree murder, guilty, third-degree murder, guilty, and second-degree manslaughter, guilty, there was a collective national sigh of relief. And the reaction was emotional. Television news cut away from regularly scheduled programming to broadcast some of the reactions. The Congressional Black Caucus members, for example, were shown huddled together, looking at their phones and other devices, nodding, hugging as they listened to the verdicts. Citizens outside the courthouse also watched on their phones. They cheered. Fists were raised high. Many people looked up in the heavens and gratitude. People held each other, and some broke down and wept. There was a similar, although more muted, emotional relief when the three men that gunned down Ahmaud Arbery were convicted a few weeks ago. And a great deal of anger was generated when Kyle Rittenhouse was found not guilty of shooting three white men and killing two of them, Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Hoover. It's undeniable that many people felt deeply gratified by the carceral responses to Chauvin's callous cruelty and the conviction of the men who killed Arbery. So many police officers and vigilantes are not arrested or tried or convicted of horrible crimes against Black people and sometimes white people. And so I want you to keep that feeling of wanting to punish close while I talk about the logics that underlie it and why I think we need to break free of these punitive impulses and abolish carceral logics. In this talk, I'll briefly unpack and explore various ways that carceral logics shape, various ways that carceral logics shape our social and political relations. These harmful carceral logics, I'll argue, hold us all captive in systems of disposability, permanent exclusions, and they should be abolished. But let's start first by talking about how I understand carceral logics. It has a lot of different meanings, and I want to be sure that we all are on the same page with what I think carceral logics are. So one way of thinking about it is that it highlights and organizes the variety of ways that our bodies and our minds and our actions have been shaped by the idea and practices of captivity, even for people who haven't been to prison. And I want to just take a moment here, especially, to say something about those of us who think about and talk about prisons who haven't been in prison. That is, those of us who haven't been locked up. I mean, I've been in a lot of prisons, as Professor Stanley just said, but that isn't important. Those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated are really the best people to talk about the weight of carceral power and how they've experienced it in their bodies and minds. And we have a lot to learn from them. I'll draw on their voices and what they've taught me throughout my talk. But part of the reason that I'm interested in talking about not carceral power per se, but carceral logics, is that it's an ideology of capture and containment that impacts all of us. Those who are incarcerated, those who are formerly incarcerated, and those of us not yet incarcerated. I want to explore what sort of thinking these carceral logics make possible, and perhaps more importantly, what sorts of ideas and practices they authorize, and what sorts of ideas and practices they foreclose. I'll identify two types of carceral logics. The first is a carceral logic that is understood as sort of organizing, capture, surveillance, and disposal. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to turn to a second type of carceral logic, which I think of as an ideology of domination. And I'll say a little bit about domination. And then after I talk about these carceral logics and you get a sense of what I mean, I will then turn to talking about why we should abolish them and how that might look. Okay, and I'm thinking that most everyone in the audience today has some sense of the sort of shape of the actual carceral system, the sort of bricks and mortar and razor wire. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. As I said, it's a little bit more conceptual, what I'm going to be talking about. But when we imprison humans, I'm going to just say a little bit now about it. When we imprison humans, we harm them in ways that are both obvious. They're in conditions that can cause physical suffering and frustration, and ways that are not so obvious. Long-term psychological impacts of boredom, anxiety, and a lack of control. Here's how a group of incarcerated men who were sentenced collectively to a total of 225 years in a maximum security prison describe a slice of their experiences. And this is from a chapter that they wrote in my edited volume called, the volume's called The Ethics of Captivity. And this piece that this comes from is, as you see here, Life Behind Bars. So what they say, and you could read along, after our initial humiliation upon being strip searched, when we enter prison, we lose all control of our lives. We will eat, bathe, and shave when told. We'll be expected to follow direct orders, no matter how absurd or unfair. Non-compliance will be met with force. The depressive environment tends to stifle intellectual curiosity. We simply become too tired and sullen to engage in intellectual pursuits. Simply put, we dwell in our cells, we're not actively using our minds, and in a very real sense, we're thus losing our minds. The loneliness caused by prisons in general and prison cells in particular is exacerbated by the loss of intimacy and the loving touch of friends and family. Those held captive are deprived of so much, including the ability to make basic choices. Of course, none of us is free to make any kind of choices we might want. We're restricted in all sorts of ways by the genders that we're assigned, by our physical and cognitive abilities, by class, by religion, by race, by ethnicity, even by our species. We're restricted by state power and other governmental and economic institutions that prescribe all sorts of choices and force others upon us. Carceral prison spaces are particularly stark in their ways of limiting and reducing the choices that are available for those who are within them. Cages and cells and iron doors, little natural light, concrete and steel, razor wire and metallic noise. And these carceral spaces are designed in part and organized by a carceral logic that makes these choices impossible. There are carceral spaces that function beyond prisons and gulags, and those also control and contain others. Immigration detention centers, zoos, laboratories, psychiatric institutions, even some senior living places are sites of containment, surveillance, and control. They're also often sites of undoing. The carceral spaces are not simply punitive, and they do not merely serve, as Foucault noted, as socializing and disciplining institutions and as sites of surveillance. Increasingly, we're seeing that they also function to reinforce a permanent state of injury. And part of that injury is the disposability of those who occupy those spaces. Some humans have always fallen into the category of disposable or fungible. People stolen from Africa and the transatlantic slave trade are prime examples, but there are an estimated 27 million people in slavery today. Kevin Bales, in his book Disposable People, conservatively estimates that a larger number of people than the whole population of Canada are currently enslaved. The bulk of these people, approximately 15 to 20 million, are in conditions of bounded labor in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. They become enslaved as security against a loan or when they inherit a debt. In other words, these persons have a price. I won't go into Kant at this moment, but those of you who are aware of Kant will now recognize that these disposable beings with a price are mere things. And then when they don't work to their capacity, they're disposed of. When you're disposable, you have lesser status. Sometimes the status is the status of a thing. And this isn't only a slight or an affront, but a way of reminding both the one being denied the status and others around that one is in the category deemed disposable, abject, other. That's one way that the carceral logics that I'm worried about operate. The other kind of logic, as I mentioned, is one of domination. There are at least two ways that we can think of domination. One that supports and maintains not just disciplinary control of bodies, but taxonomies of power. The other upholds ontological exclusions or outsideness and the violence it authorizes. The first sort of domination is characterized by its justificatory power, upholding oppressive institutions, relationships, and practices. Domination, according to political philosopher Philip Pettit, occurs when a person is in a position in which someone has the power to arbitrarily interfere with choices they would otherwise have been able to make. And this notion of domination is pretty expansive because the interference just needs to be possible in the form of a threat. It has wide-reaching ramifications in that one can internalize the potential to be the victim of domination, and one can imagine one has the power to dominate, and so act as if it's their privilege. And this way of thinking naturalizes or normalizes domination. Remedying this sort of carceral logic is important in many contexts when the dominator and the dominated exist on the same plane, when they are at the same table, as it were. What I'm thinking of here is that the relationship of dominated and dominator, or domination, the dominator and the submissive, this may be a relationship in which both are recognized as having a capacity to switch roles, and the roles are just at this particular juncture, because of particular political and social and probably historical features of the situation, end up having that divergent relationship of domination and submission. But it's not it's a kind of fixable domination, as it were. If you think about the example, also I was thinking teachers and students, there's a certain relation of power there, but domination by overt domination, that's objectionable domination, not just the relationship of power, but the objectively problematic domination can be called out by the student. Similarly, students have a certain amount of power. They can also be called out by a teacher about their abuse of that power. So what I'm getting at here is that this particular version of domination sort of recognizes the possibility of remedy. But there's a deeper type of injury associated with carceral logics of domination, for those for whom domination is a condition of existence. This is what I meant earlier when I said it has an ontological flavor. The idea here is that there's a category, the slave, the prisoner, the animal, and that category is fundamentally lower status. There's no way of objecting to this domination relationship. It's the condition of existence. This carceral logic that these categorical individuals are subjected to goes beyond this first sort of domination. Here is a logic that serves as a conceptual mechanism that fixes and solidifies exclusions. It permanently marks another as an other. This sort of carceral logic is especially obvious in anti-Black racism, for example. Okay, so this was my brief discussion of two types of carceral logics that I'm concerned about. We can talk more, I hope we will later, but these carceral logics organize our systems of captivity for humans, and I should add also for animals, and they structure domination that consistently denies many humans the very chance of being free. Carceral logics have also colonized our minds, making it hard to imagine how we can make any changes. This is why we have the emotions we have when Chauvin was found guilty, and why we more often have the disappointments that we have when many of those in power are not charged or tried or convicted when they act with egregious violence against the powerless. I have those too, even though I've been thinking about these issues for a really long time. I still have that. It's not possible to completely escape the way in which carceral logics have colonized our thinking. It is really hard to get out of it, in other words. But I think we can abolish these carceral logics from our thinking and our feeling and our acting. And we can work at least to free our imaginations and create the ground to stand and think against such logics. And one way we can do that is by thinking about abolition. And abolition has a lot of different, again, like carceral logics, abolition is a big category. There's a lot of different ways of understanding what it means. Many people think of it in terms of the abolition of prisons themselves. I'm thinking of it more in this context as a way of getting outside of carceral logics, so abolishing carceral logics. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of abolition as a notion as well. But I want us to sort of put aside the notion of abolishing prisons, even though that is not, it's consistent with what I'm saying, but it's not the focus of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about abolition. So abolition, as I understand it in this discussion, is a framework for reimagining our own agency, for re-envisioning our communities, and for reframing our social and political relations. In a fairly recent, I think last year or the year before, New York Times article about geographer and abolitionist Ruthie Gilmore, law professor James Foreman Jr. said that, quote, "What I love about abolition, and now use in my own thinking, and when I identify myself as an abolitionist, this is what I have in mind, is the idea that you imagine a world without prisons, and then you work to build that world. Or in my terms, you imagine a world without carceral logics, and then you work to build that world." So abolition is aspirational. Imagining otherwise, moving against carceral logics, will be trying. We're asked to think in fundamentally different ways, thinking that's contextual, relational, historical, maybe even poetic, with a little bit of what Devanya Havis, a philosopher, describes as alchemy. We'll need ingenuity to negotiate what seems impossible. So before getting into how we might move in the direction of imagining how to negotiate impossibility or what seems impossible, let me say a little bit about the history of abolition. So the term abolition is best known, of course, in the context of opposition to the Atlantic slave trade. Early abolitionists were opposed to the violent accumulation of wealth due to forced labor. According to Manisha Sinha, in her book, The Slave's Cause, abolitionists, though primarily concerned with resisting slavery, had wide-reaching concerns. And I'll leave this up so you can see what she thinks are as also being really important and a part of what it was that abolitionists, the early abolitionists, were doing. So with the abolition of slavery after the Civil War, many abolitionists were actively reimagining how to bring the ideals of democracy into fuller practice. So democracy was a big commitment of these early abolitionists, and the abolitionists after, including, importantly, sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, noted that abolition democracy demanded the structural reform of labor, education, and opportunities. Now, notice, so we're going from the thought of abolition of slavery and forced labor practices to a different way of thinking about how to organize our communities and the opportunities and resources that are available within those communities. This is an important point. It wasn't enough to emancipate Black people from slavery. Many envisioned building a free and equal society in which the disadvantages that emerged from the system of slavery were not permanent. But as I was suggesting, the second version of carceral logics has a kind of afterlife. And that afterlife is something that we see at the end of Reconstruction as well. And the re-implementation of the Black codes, which perpetuated forms of unfreedom for Black people. For example, they could be prosecuted for not carrying proof of employment, which led to incarceration and with it forced labor. So in the South, what this amounted to was a convict leasing program. And the growing population of Black prisoners ended up going back to work without pay. And it was an extraordinarily abusive system. Du Bois quotes from a Southern white woman, and this is what she says. In some states where convict labor is sold to the highest bidder, the cruel treatment of the helpless human chattel in the hands of guards is such as no tongue can tell, nor pen picture. Prison inspectors find convicts herded together, irrespective of age, and there were a lot of children, actually, a lot of children, confined at night in shackles, housed sometimes, as has been found in old boxcars, packed almost as closely as sardines in a box. During the day, all are worked under armed guards who stand ready to shoot down any who may attempt to escape from this hell upon earth, the modern American Bastille. Should one escape, the bloodhounds trained for the purpose are put upon his tracks, and the chances are that he will be brought back severely flogged and put in double shackles or worse. As the shocking conditions of convict leasing became widely known, pressure built to end the practice, and one by one, Southern states didn't renew or initiate the leases. Alabama was the final state to end convict leasing in 1928. Okay, fast forward. I'm a philosopher, not a historian, sorry. Fast forward to 1970s. So 1928 to the 1970s, lots happened, but we'll just fast forward. There were a new form of abolition emerged, and that was led a lot by Quakers, and it was a form of abolition against prisons. And importantly, it's 1976, so you know that mass incarceration really wasn't really full on in that period, but there were nonetheless prison abolitionists. The first chapter of a book that was put together by Faye Honey Knopp called Instead of Prisons, with a group of Quakers and other political actors. In the first chapter, they have comments from lawyers and judges and prisoners and those employed or formerly employed by prisons, authors, activists, and many who condemned prisons. And these are just some of the examples. And I think it's really quite striking how a judge, professor at Columbia, a former psychiatrist at Sing Sing, all were in favor of abolishing the prisons. And again, this is abolishing prisons prior to our current era of mass incarceration. Okay, that's my brief historical tour. Now you may have some concerns and reactions about the idea of abolition. Most people do. It invokes a variety of different kinds of feelings, like incredulity and disdain, to curiosity and excitement. And these reactions also vary depending on the context in which the topic of abolition is being raised, and the ways that it's being discussed. So I want to give you this recent example from 2017. The ACLU conducted a survey that found that 61% of Americans believe that people who suffer from drug addiction and commit serious crimes don't belong in prison, but should receive treatment. And 87% believe that when people with mental health disabilities commit serious crimes that involve violence, they should be sent to mental health programs where they can receive treatment from professionals, so not to prison. So this is recent, and this is a huge majority of the US population. Such strong public support for these non-carceral responses to violent crimes are, I think, really important to note in a country that locks up over 2 million people. And as feminist scholar and abolitionist Joy James has noted, Abolitionist alternatives to prisons are already available for those with wealth and power. She writes, existential whiteness, money or capital, and connections to governing elites allow offenders, if prosecuted and convicted, to be largely redirected to therapy, counseling, drug treatment, and expensive residential treatment centers. But abolishing prisons is only one way, as I've suggested, of thinking about abolition. I think it's an important project. Don't get me wrong, I'm involved in that project. However, tonight I'm really thinking of abolishing carceral logics. And that is consistent, as I said, with abolishing prisons. But I think I'm more interested tonight in talking about how we can end our acceptance of punitive responses to crime and other acts that are outside of the accepted norms, and to begin imagining alternatives to these carceral logics. In a society like ours that's organized by profound inequality, abolitionists are working to develop more just and meaningful social policy that will help support community needs and build alternative humane institutions. These efforts involve promoting non-reformist reforms that are, I think, a really important idea that allow for the development of policies and practices that minimize harm and also at the same time don't contribute to or reinforce carceral logics. So let me just give you some examples of what I think are non-reformist reforms. We can discuss this further if this is something that you either disagree with or don't think makes sense. But the program, the Center for Prison Education, which is at Wesleyan, is a program that I've been involved in from the beginning, and also the newer but also quite robust program at Yale, the Yale Prison Education Initiative, are both what I would call non-reformist reforms. What do I mean by that? I think that part of what we should be understanding when we're thinking about non-reformist reforms is ways in which some of the logic of the carceral logic and the implications of carceral logic can be undone, but the prison remains and the education is happening in prison. I'm not advocating that the prison remains, but I'm suggesting that in the moment when the prison exists, that it's possible to provide educational opportunities that allow those people who are incarcerated and able to enroll in various classes to be able to get their opportunities that they didn't have, to be exposed to ideas that they weren't exposed to prior, that they're also able to develop their own ways of thinking about themselves in relationship to others, in relationship to the state, in relationship to our fragile democracy or non-existent democracy, in relation to all sorts of social and political structures. So it's a non-reformist reform? Because even though those of us who do this work, have to abide by the carceral rules of the departments of correction, we can work within those systems, within the first version of carceral logics, to undermine the very sort of strategies of carceral logics, to undermine the very attitudes that are a part of the carceral logics. I've also included the Freedom Reads Project, which is another, I think, non-reformist reform, putting freedom libraries, micro libraries of 500 books into prisons all across the country. And I also included here on this slide some ideas about mutual aid that has become really important in the context of the pandemic, where communities are working together to help each other outside of the various systems that are confining and containing and have colonized our thinking. So Part of the mutual aid process has involved redirecting local budgets to help those who are food insecure or housing insecure or vulnerable to substance use, developing opportunities to support youth, to creating community-based harm reduction programs, working on supporting victims of harm through restorative justice practices and holding those who caused harm accountable in a non-carceral way, as well as other practical efforts to build a more caring world. And these sorts of community programs, I think, are extraordinarily meaningful because they both allow for community accountability, but they also allow us to reimagine our social relations outside of these carceral logics. Many of you may be thinking, at least I would have thought this at one point in my life, that this is all utopian. This is a kind of utopian notion. And in some ways, I do think that's true. I think that it may very well be utopian, but I'm trying to reframe my thinking about utopia. And I'll say a bit about that in a sec. But this is a really, I think, important insight that I learned from philosopher William Paris, who writes that utopias have been attempts to carve an alternative space of life that was sufficiently disconnected from the dominant social order. Utopia need not concern itself with designing a perfect life. Instead, utopia may take up the task of creating social spaces that allow for deliberation over different ideas about how we might organize our social relations. Utopia is the creation of an alternative public sphere for testing out ideas and disagreements over novel forms of social life. So in this sense, I think all social theorizing might be thought to be utopian. Confinement, captivity, and carceral logics that I've been discussing are so central to our social imagination that it's challenging to think beyond them. And utopian thinking is what will help unsettle our imaginations so we can start to expand the horizons of possibility. To move beyond carceral logics and their punitive manifestations in practice, we need what abolitionist Erica Miner calls for, quote, a jailbreak of the imagination in order to make the impossible possible. Utopian thinking can free the imagination from the constraints of the violent, oppressive, and limiting social conditions that currently exist in the US, but such thinking is not only aimed at some hope for a peaceful future. By imagining otherwise, we are being asked to think in fundamentally different new ways. And one of the new ways I'd like to talk about as I wind down my discussion tonight is what I'm calling an abolitionist ethic of care. An abolitionist ethic of care would focus on the particularities of caring relationships informed by differences in context, as well as the racial, economic, ethnic, cultural, and differently gendered experiences of individuals and those they care for in community. An ethics of care, I think, is well suited to be the basis of an abolitionist praxis. Care ethics, in more general terms, allows us to formulate better understandings of ethical problems. We turn to ethical theories in conditions of conflict, generally all ethical theories, to gain insights into how we might find solutions to hard to solve social and political issues. An ethic of care addresses situations of conflict, of course, but also is concerned with how people come to see a moral problem as a problem in the first place, and works to develop moral imagination, not only as a way of reframing problems, but also as a way to move towards more just and sustainable solutions to those kinds of problems. In the exercise of moral imagination, care ethics is attentive to differences in power, as well as the cultural underpinnings of systems of exploitation, commodification, and cruelty. By analyzing the specific context in which systems of power operate, Care ethics is concerned about the larger structures that allow and contribute to various forms of injustice and inequality. Care ethics also directs our attention to the specific particular people that are involved in the conflicts, and in so doing, helps us to reframe our concerns. It encourages the development of empathy and compassion. But care is also a capacity that has to be nurtured or cared for. Care needs to be nurtured and cared for itself. And carceral logics, another feature of carceral logic is they detach us from care, and they promote that sort of detachment. An abolitionist ethic would involve reimagining our caring relations and encourage and deepen them. It also requires an analysis of the impacts of failures of care, both before carceral solutions are sought when harms are committed, and in critiquing the dehumanizing conditions that exist in carceral spaces. An abolitionist ethic of care can help both victims and those who caused harm reframe their experiences. Part of the solution to seemingly intractable conflicts is to care for oneself in relations of respect and also self-respect. As feminist thinker Sarah Ahmed notes, and here she's drawing on another feminist thinker, Audre Lorde, this is a quote, "The work of self-care is about the creation of community, fragile communities assembled out of the experiences of being shattered. We reassemble ourselves through the ordinary, everyday, and often painstaking work of looking after ourselves and looking after each other." End quote. An ethics of care is not meant to be a sort of condescending intervention where care covers over pity or some equally contemptuous attitude, but rather it's an ethic that works to create the conditions in which caring for oneself and for others are developed, practiced, and valued. It's restorative and transformative work. Carceral logics lead us to misguided attempts to try to bring about some sort of justice. As I've tried to suggest tonight, there are alternatives to this way of thinking and feeling that inflicts more harm and does very little to fundamentally change people's attitude towards the harm caused by these logics. Abolitionists have been working to develop ways of reimagining our relationships and our responses to harm that don't involve punitive carceral actions. An abolitionist ethic of care is a promising area for revaluing those who are harmed, those who cause harm, and the broader community who are impacted, not just by the pain of harms that have been committed, but by the harms that are inflicted by the state in their name. Caring, empathetic, reimagining is what we need to escape carceral logics, and it's crucial to promoting and achieving freedom. Thanks. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Professor Gruen. That was great. Now I'm so if please place your questions in the Q&A, and I will moderate. I'll go through them and moderate debate. So let's begin. I guess. So let's begin first with one question, which is about which is about can you connect this to your work? So you're a theorist of the ethics of captivity. One of the questions saw, I think, very clearly the link between your arguments and your position on animal ethics. Do you want to talk about that link and expand on it?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. work that you heard me say a little bit throughout the discussion, that that I'm interested in thinking about this in terms of animals as well, and the ways in which species itself might be a type of carceral logic. And so importantly, the work that I was thinking about, I started to realize, and this is very dangerous, and I'm well aware of the dangers, and so I want to just highlight, caveat, that these are not comparisons between animals in captive environments, say zoos, and humans in prisons or gulags or other kinds of carceral enclosure. But so I'm not making a sort of simplistic comparison here, but I do think that the underlying, the background ideas, the logic that allows for the kinds of things I talked about: disposability, incapacity, disrespect, lack of value, permanent injury. Those are the kinds of things that I think are part of the conceptualization that's a feature of the carceral logic that allows for and is sort of prior to the existence of these carceral spaces. And so I think there's a very tight link between the ways in which we imagine, some humans imagine themselves as being in a position of just clear domination in some scala natra about we're just higher up than these other animals. And similarly and importantly, the sort of racist attitudes are very similar, that they're somehow higher, the Aryan is higher up. So I think these are part and parcel of the same kind of project. And I do have a project, a book coming out with a law professor at the University of Denver, Justin Marceau, in which we talk about these parallels. It's called Carceral Logics, Human Captivity and Animal Confinement. It'll be out in May.
Professor Gruen is, that question really revealed, brought out the way that your talk clearly generalized to that in the way that your philosophical position does as well. So let's go to an edgy question. Yale perpetuates carceral logics. How can we use methods of non-reformist reform to challenge these harms?
Well, I think I need a little bit more context for the specific ways in which Yale does this. I think it's not actually just Yale. I mean, I do think our institutions like the carceral logic shoots through the institutions in which we do non-reform, in which we discuss these matters. That's right. That's right.
And so how does one deal with that kind of performative contradiction? Aren't you a hypocrite, ...
Right. Yeah, no, and I think that's the performative contradiction point is a really important one. And I think that, if you go back to the origins of the notion of non-reformist reforms, it's in the context of thinking about what to do. Can we make any small changes, or do we have to wait for the socialist revolution? I think that the idea of non-reformist reforms is that the reason I like using mutual aid as a really important example of that is that you don't go to the system to ask the system to help with the problem, because the system is designed to make it so you need help with the problem, right? So and this is part of the idea, is that people say the prison system is broken. No, the prison system is working exactly the way it was designed to work. So making modest reforms in that system is not going to do anything to undo the system. And I think with every institution, obviously, this is part of what I was saying at the beginning. We're in a position where that's really hard to imagine outside of these structures. I'm not pretending that somehow philosophically I can just sort of will this imagination into existence. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. It's a very, very, very hard project. But I do think there are various ways that we can develop different social relations. And, like we can think about it in terms of, there's movement afoot around getting rid of grades, for example. That would be something that would be a non-reformist reform. You could still go to school, but you argue that we don't want grades. Those are the kinds of things that I think people can do. Ultimately, these aren't going to be top-down sort of changes either. What you want to have is in a community, in a group, hopefully an inclusive group with multiple people who are in multiple social and political locations working together. And I know that there are sort of all sorts of activities at Yale that are like that. There are lots and lots of folks who are doing really important non-reformist reform work there.
Right.
And what? Sorry.
Just a codicil to the points you made. Like Rod Ferguson points out that the purpose of like the university ombudsman is to get people to complain, is to undercut any student movement that might occur, to get people to complain to the institution itself to fix the problem. Right. So then they can make minor reforms without challenging the institution itself, to make the institution itself the place where you complain, to make sure that the institution is always the logic governing everything.
That's a good codicil. Another way of thinking about that, and more pertinent in my world lately, is that the faculty might organize for better benefits or better pay, and the university sort of enlists certain members of the faculty and says, okay, let's give you better benefits and you better pay, or let's give everybody a little bit of a benefit, but not the full benefit. It's sort of a sort of co-opting the problem. And that was this exact set of debates that went on between revolution and reform in the early moment when people were arguing in favor of non-reformist reforms. A really important question.
Right. So there's a structure to institutional abolition. And we can think of institutional abolition, say, dramatic generally, and then there's a structure to counter abolition, which is to allow incremental reforms. Yeah,
that's right.
So Jennifer Klein asks, my distinguished labor historian here at Yale, to use ethics of care as a foundation for abolition, do we need to also question the premise of liberal citizenship that fetishizes independence? Care is about relations of interdependence, yet our political culture disdains and stigmatizes anything that can be cast as dependence. So how do we reconcile dominant citizenship ideas with the model you present, or change them? Also, Kathy Week discusses utopian thinking, not as having to be fully formed, rather as bridge to the alternative structure we want.
Yes. Great questions, super questions. I highly recommend the CARE manifesto that came out last year by the CARE Collective. And I think it does really think we need to, if you're really going to think about abolition in a full-blown way, which I did not do in this talk at all, but if we're going to think about it in a full-blown way, we are absolutely going to have to reconsider the kind of liberal citizen formation that exists. And I think that there are different forms of care ethics. My idea of care ethics is not one in which you can internalize or the system can co-opt care. So sort of basically pay for care, or even, make it so that it's part of the system. That's absolutely something that we see happening all around, particularly vivid in the pandemic times. So I think that it's important to think about an ethics of care as a much more fundamentally relational idea. It isn't going to be an idea that's based on independence or individualism or any of those kinds of distinguishing, detaching notions. It's a fundamentally, and I think of the quote from Sarah Ahmad is making a point of this, that the self is in inextricable relation with others, that this is and what I call entangled relation with others. And these are these aren't things to try to disentangle, but to try to navigate, to negotiate, and to build better relations. And so I think absolutely in the political realm, there will need to be a very important discussion. And there have been people doing this work. Joan Taranto's another who's done really important work in rethinking how care can fit into a rearrangement of political relations.
I'm still mute. Let me turn now to a student in the class who has two questions. I'll start with the first and then go to another question. So the first is about the reproduction of carceral logics in cancel culture. This I'm going to add to this So the argument for this statement follows as cancel culture does not focus on teaching people the error of their ways, just places them outside the circle of public view in a similar way to how prisons label people as problems and sequester them from society. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that's exactly right. I think that there is a carceral logic that's operating in cancel culture. I think too, though, importantly, and this is what I was trying to get at when I didn't have time to fully develop the idea, but there is a kind of affective longing, as it were, for something to go right. And I think that presumably there's an important way in which what we should be recognizing in cancel culture is that there's already something sort of disturbed in our thinking that makes us want to cancel someone else. Now, that isn't to say, so I think I don't want to in any way sort of overly psychologize that longing. I think it speaks to the ways that our social relations are shallow or not robust, or there's something missing in our social relations. And it's in virtue of that we develop these kinds of us, them, good, like you guys are the good guys and we're the bad guys. And I think, you talk about this too in your fascism book, but there's this us, them thing has a certain kind of hold on us when we live in a broken state. I guess that's what I say when I say a broken society, when our fundamental humanity and our fundamental animality isn't being addressed or isn't being attended to. And that developed, so then we one way to respond to that sort of social hollowness, if you will, is to sort of develop this, okay, I'm going to cancel you, or you have to be set aside. Now, I do want to say this brings to mind a really important point that I want to make about abolition more generally. I think it's also really important to keep in mind, and cancel culture is somewhat connected to this, that there are actually people who we don't want to interact with. We don't want in our communities. We don't want. And I'm not pretending that everybody is somebody that we could that we should embrace. So I want to also acknowledge this isn't Pollyanna. It might be utopian, but it's a different kind of utopian. It's not Pollyannish. It's not like, oh, well, let's all get along. No, it's nothing like that.
The next question from Joe Fischel is about the relationship between carceral logics and punitive logic, so there's how what do we do, and then it shifts. So the first question is about analytically separating carceral logics from punitive logics or punitive imaginaries, and then Professor Fischel wonders, what do we do with sort of the desire for libidinized retribution?
So, right. I'm not separating carceral logics from punitive logics. There's a part of that punitive logic that is part of the carceral. It's sort of subsumed. Carceral logic subsumes that retributivist sort of instinct or impulse. And so then the question becomes, okay, so there's a distinction to be made there. I'm not sure it matters. I like to think, I mean, I like to talk about it in terms of carceral logics, precisely because of the point that Professor Stanley made, that I'm interested in captivity in a general way. Punishment itself is an interesting separate question, but my interests are in the captive, in the carceral, and punishment is a feature of that whole system. But I think the idea of retributivism is, and the impulse towards it, that feeling that I was evoking at the beginning of my talk, where I encouraged us to be thinking about why it is that we want these, particularly people in power who abuse their power, to be punished. I think, again, I would just go back to what I was saying, that desire, and I'm not denying that it's there, because it is there, and I have it too. But that desire is a feature of a distorted system, right? And, I can't help but think of Catherine McKinnon whenever I talk about this, which is, essentially that we can't really we can't think about what it might be like. Catherine McKinnon uses the sort of idea about sexual desire, but the notion is like, we don't really know what it would be like to have genuine desire outside of patriarchy, because we live in patriarchy. And I think the same thing is something that I would want to say. I think the desires that we have for punishment and retribution are a feature of the carceral system that we live in, and the carceral logic that's colonized our thinking. And that if we're able to get beyond that carceral logic, and I hope we could do that through really thinking and imagining otherwise, through a kind of abolitionist ethic of care, that we might actually be able to figure out that we're not committed to retributivism. And in philosophy, in the philosophy of law and in philosophy of punishment, there's been a lot of debates about sort of what is the underlying moral, ethical, political values that are achieved through punishment. And I think already this is a good example of something that you're buying into the carceral system. So we're going to debate at the edges, should it be retributive, or should it be, like we're trying to deter people, or is this just really a utilitarian way of dealing with? But that already is within the system. And my view is that we really need to challenge the system of thinking about why that's the way we want to organize our lives. So, for example, what would we do with somebody who is really egregious, nobody could handle? I don't know, put them, just, turn your back on them, or don't let them into your home, or don't let them into your community, or don't let them into your space.
So the way I understand it, your response is, an idea. Don't think of carceral logic as like a set of principles. Think of it as an ideology, where an ideology is principles, practices, and attitudes and emotions to things. And you've got to eliminate the entire ideology. The desire for retribution is part of an ideology. An ideology is not just a logic. And hopefully, if we get rid of the structure, the hypothesis is we'll get rid of those feelings of retribution. Though it does seem to me that the feelings of retribution last through a number of different forms of punishment, even before the prison, say. The carceral logic you're trying to get rid of is much deeper than just the prison.
Yeah, that's right.
Shelley asks about how we broaden this. So Professor is a very distinguished philosopher of disability. Asks how we include carceral logics and abolition, how we broaden that to include institutions and social phenomena such as nursing homes, psych wards, group homes for disabled people, etc.
Well, I put them in that list earlier. Shelley, Professor partly because you've done such important and interesting work and continue to do work, particularly through the pandemic on these institutions. But that's partly why it's really important to think about this as Professor Stanley was just saying, as an ideology, or as I'm thinking of it, an overarching logic that applies beyond the prison situation and beyond the zoo. I mean, we really need to think about those as canonical cases, but there are many places in which the structure is designed precisely to hold on to those that are within it in a diminished way, and the institutions require that. There's also some really important work on deinstitutionalization that's been done, that is particularly in the area of psychiatric institutions, that also takes abolition in a very special and important direction. So obviously I couldn't speak to all of these issues, including the animal issue that is so sort of close to my heart tonight, but thank you for raising that, Shelley.
I'm going to put myself in the queue, even though that's a slight violation of decorum. So I wanted to go back to Professor Klein's question about liberal citizenship and ask about, ask a sort of maybe devil's advocate kind of question about the ethics of care background to your work, which, so there's a way of attacking, there's a way of going at this, which leans on liberal citizenship, which says that what's happening in prisons is a violation of equality of citizenship. And when you're asking people to be responsible for their actions, you're considering them as equal citizens. This is the kind of thing that Douglas says in What to the Slave is the 4th of July. He's like, you're not dehumanizing us, because you're treating us as responsible for our actions. But then this method of treating us is sort of, it undercuts the equality of citizenship that taking us as responsible for our actions seems to presuppose. But all of that is within the framework of liberal citizenship. There's a kind of, the way I think of it, I mean, one kind of reasoning I'm attracted to is, well, this kind of treatment of fellow citizens is incompatible with treating them as responsible for their actions, treating them as equal citizens in this more full-blooded liberal sense. What survives from that? And that's a very different basis, one that doesn't generalize as much as an ethics of care view does to, say, captivity of animals.
Well, okay, so there's a lot in that, and if I'm understanding, I mean, I think that the problem with the liberal citizenship model is it buys into, or it presupposes a very specific form of agency, a very specific form of responsibility, a very specific form of identity that is part of upholding the liberal framework. So it has this way in which we have a framework that imagines us as sort of individuals outside of social, political, familial, intimate relations. And then it creates the conditions for making it so that if we don't do something, it looks like our freedom or our agency is being violated. I'm not making the, what I'm trying to suggest is that sort of there's a self-fulfilling and a self-sustaining part of liberal citizenship that makes it seem, and it's not just liberal citizenship, it's Kant. I mean, it's actually, it goes farther back in a sense, so that there's this idea that what it means to be responsible, what it means to be an agent, what it means to be a member of a functioning ethical world is that I have value. My value is tied to myself as recognizing that value, as Professor Chris Korsgaard would say, it's tethered to me. And I want to go back farther than that and say, no, that presupposition that we somehow sort of appear as individuals fully formed is just a fiction, and that fiction.
Right. I get that's what you want to do, but it doesn't seem. I mean, I think, in other words, you can have a Kantian abolitionist program, though. I mean, you haven't argued that you can't.
Right.
You haven't argued that you can't, right? But but abolition in the ethics of caring framework is a much more philosophically radical program. Then you can imagine an abolitionist program extending from abolition of slavery that's ideologically consistent with it, that remains within the liberal tradition.
Right. No, I think I mean, that's a really important point. And I think that I wasn't arguing actually in that vein. I do think that there's a sense, however, that we can get in trouble at some juncture if we go that route. And the trouble is that we're reinforcing the system that's built on, I mean, carceral logics come out of that system. And so I don't know how that system can survive without carceral logic. But it's an important point, and I should probably think about it's a very important point that I should probably think about the ways in which I didn't argue this, but I think there is an important sense in which the sort of genesis, as it were, of the relationship of the genesis of the carceral logic and this liberal citizen notion is actually, I think, worth my sort of cashing out a little bit. Thank you.
I mean, Murakawa, I think, tries to argue that liberalism results in in carceral logic, but I don't think it's, I love Naomi Murakawa's work, but I'm not completely convinced that, that it's not a contingent fact of history, what Murakawa describes. And okay, let me go to more questions. So let's see. Wow. Oh, sorry, I was on the okay. Open. Here we are. So one, let me just look to see. Right. Professor Klein weighs in to point out that the people who developed the asylum and the penitentiary saw them as involved in a project of care. Right, and that's definitely one thing. Even solitary confinement was envisaged in Eastern States Penitentiary that way.
Right, that's right. So, but I think that it's important. I think that these notions of care, I think the idea of care is not just I care. So I'm gonna say, so early forms of solitary confinement, as Lisa Gunther so brilliantly points out, were designed precisely to care for the person who's gone astray and allow them time to reflect on themselves and to develop sort of a quiet mind, this so that they can move in a very more productive direction. And I think that that's partly, I hinted at this, care, as I'm understanding it, is not that sort of condescending, paternalistic, pitying sort of notion. And there is, I think, important debate amongst care theorists about what sorts of care we're talking about. And there is, just to go back to your earlier point, there's a very rich tradition of liberal care theorists that are developing views about when can care be monetized, when can it be sort of incorporated into a sort of financial exchange, when is it, and those sorts of questions. That isn't the care I'm thinking about, but of course it exists, yes.
Professor Klein notes an anti-hierarchical form of collective care is what we need. Zohar, again, another question from a student who wants to hear about your thoughts on endowment justice activism, and in particular, how it measures up as a kind of non-reformist reform.
So I think this is a really exciting and interesting question, and thinking, I would like to hear a little bit more about this kind of activism, but if I'm thinking of what it triggers for me, it's this idea that somehow this whole, well, maybe you can tell me before I start launching into this.
Well, this is like, asking the university to no longer be invested in fossil fuels.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. That's what I was thinking, but then I thought, wait, maybe there's some other thing here. Right. So, I mean, I think these kinds of things aren't they, I don't know if they are non-reformist. I think ultimately, and this is tricky, but ultimately sort of moving around capital from one thing to another holds on to the structure. And so my sense is that just as divestment in the area of fossil fuels, for example, and, or techno solutions to, climate change, sort of all of those things are part of, are just another form of sort of maintaining the system. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but I think if you think about non-reformist reforms seriously, it really doesn't mean that you can move money from one drawer to the other. That's too reformist. It's not non-reformist. What you would need to do is take the money from that drawer and give it to the people who don't have any money. That would be non-reformist, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about divesting. So I think that's just a reform. It's not a non-reformist reform.
Yes. Sometimes I worry that the kinds of reforms we ourselves get involved in, we're wishful thinking that they're non-reformist reforms, but well, that's just simply how life is.
Right. And that's I do want to just say this. This is hard. This is hard intellectually. This is hard emotionally. This is hard to do in the system. And and there really is no such thing as clean hands, no such thing as being pure, no such thing as being righteous. You do what you can do.
Yeah. And as Christy Dotson said in that conference we ran, injustice means that all the options are bad. So Anna Marie asks a really interesting question about the functioning of a criminal court system in abolishing carceral logics. And also relatedly, is there a difference in wanting a conviction for the purpose of society's disapproval of certain actions and not necessarily wanting incarceration?
Yeah, so I think these are two really interesting questions. I don't think that the criminal court system that we have ever known is non-carceral. In fact, it is carceral logics that organizes whichever system those might be. And there was early systems, for those of you who are interested in animals, there were early systems where animals were put on trial for doing various things because animals were thought to have agency and responsibility. But criminal court systems are designed, are sort of a feature of the carceral logics organizes all criminal court systems. So it's not clear to me that you could have a non-carceral criminal court system. The second question though, is a question about maybe wanting some sort of acknowledgement or accountability. Am I hearing that right? Without having punishment. And that is certainly the project of many people who are working in restorative justice work and transformative justice work. The idea that what we want, it's not that everybody can do whatever they want and there's no consequences and nobody's going to be upset, nobody's going to be hurt. That's absolutely, that's the kind of utopianism that I really don't like. It's the idea instead is that when people do harm, when people cause harm, when people bring about harm. The way to address that is not through a system of a punitive system, a prison system, a legal system. It's through a system of community accountability. And even there, that's what I was saying earlier, and even through that system of community accountability, there may be some people that just don't make sense to have around us in our community, whatever our community is. And then we have to figure out what to do in that kind of situation. And I could imagine that if a community decides to, say, exile somebody, that this would, to that person exiled, look very much like a carceral exclusion. And I would hope a process would be in place. Again, this is all philosophical imagination. This isn't any specific case I'm thinking about. But I would hope that the process would already say that if you aren't going to be willing to work with us in community about accountability, then this will potentially be an outcome. So it's not something that is sprung upon somebody who isn't aware of it.
I'm right to think, following from your talk, that rethinking the ideology that is carceral logic, carceral ideology, will require rethinking every institution. It can't be, or many institutions. It can't be done because you can't disaggregate the prison from the rest of society's institutions which replicate it. I'm incorporating one of the questions, which is about Yale's relation to its community, and I'm thinking, which does involve, I think, elements of carceral logics, elements of, but so I'm wondering. So policing would be an obvious one, but I'm wondering, the utopian imagination that you describe when you talk about William Paris, how much revision? This is a society-wide revision, right?
Yes. I mean, I think it has to be. And I think it has to be in multiple dimensions. Obviously, this is a sort of a project that, like what you just mentioned, and my thinking about what this project could look like just makes me sort of tremble in terror of the hugeness or the enormity of it. So I'm not going to feel comfortable at all answering it in a way that is like, yes, oh, this is what we need. But I do think it has ramifications. It has ramifications to how we treat animals. If you think about that, just think about that. Just think about that for a second. What would it take to fundamentally rethink our relationships with it? I mean, it really requires starting over, going somewhere else. It's in every part of our system. So I think that's part of the issue. And I think that carceral logics are so much a part of everything. And we can't, part of the utopianism for me is not just,
can I intervene there just to expand on that? So here we have a difference between a liberal abolitionist program and the kind of ethics of care abolitionist program you envision. The liberal program would say prisons are inconsistent with equal liberal citizenship. And so this is not really a radical revision. We're just knocking prisons out. And that will, if Angela Davis is right, bring back the prison. If you're leaving a prison-shaped footprint. Mm-hmm. What you're saying, if you really want to eliminate the prison, you have to have a much more fundamental reimagining. And here is a more fundamental reimagining I can offer. It's not just that the prison involves treating some of citizens not as liberal, equal co-citizens. That's right. It's that the whole system needs to be thought, and then we're not going to do this again.
Right. That's right. It won't revert back to the problem that we currently have. And it won't lead to a shinier, fancier, Sweden-like prison system either.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think, let's see if there are so there's one more question about how an ethics of care can be applied to quarantining and lockdown related to COVID-19, such as Australia's Howard Springs, or whether you believe that's relevant at all.
I'm not sure I understand fully the question. Yeah. I think that ethics of care, I
think that's not a carceral situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right.
Okay. So thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, Professor Gruen, for bringing our bringing our semester to an end with that incredible lecture that enables us to think through this long path we've taken this semester. So thank you for your work and your activism over the years.
Thank you for having me. It was a delight. And thank you for your great questions, everyone.
All right. Bye. Bye, everyone.